Let's stick with Canberra politics. We're joined for some sharp analysis by Credit Regular and Sky Political Editor Andrew Clennell. Great to see you, Andrew. I just want to put this little theory past you. We had an election in May. Anthony Albanese won a thumping majority. He can pretty much do what he wants for the next 3 years. He got hammered today by the major media outlets, the Australian, the Daily Telegraph, the Herald Sun, people like Greg Sheridan, people like Paul Kelly, saying this was a disaster and a gift to Hamas. Would he care about that coverage?
Oh, you always care a bit, but not too much, I don't think. And I think he's been largely spurred on by Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron in what he's done here. I don't think a few weeks ago he was going to do this or necessarily going to do this, but they've spoken to him and they've helped talk him into it, and Penny Wong's probably for it as well. So he's gone the way he's gone. And yeah, I think you did expect some of this coverage because they timed it a few weeks out from the US visit, which I think is significant if he wants to get on with Donald Trump, but also the day before we expected a rate cut. So I do feel that he thought, I can get this out there, get it out of the way, and then we can move on to the rate cut as the main issue, in the media and sort of change the subject.
Well, Greg Sheridan, who you and I admire greatly, he's been the foreign editor of The Australian for a very long time. He said today, and I want to get your view on this because you know New South Wales politics better than anyone. He said this call has little to do with politics in the Middle East, plenty to do with domestic landscape. He even named, suburbs with large Islamic populations in Melbourne and Sydney. Is he right?
Well, domestic politics always is a consideration, always plays a part, but I think it's a bit big to say it's just about domestic politics. I think, Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong actually think this can make a difference, and I don't think it can. So I disagree with them. I have to say, as an analyst, I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I just think you can go on about recognising a Palestinian state or even recognise it. It doesn't stop the war. It doesn't stop Palestinian kids starving. It doesn't stop hostages being held. It doesn't stop Hamas. And, what role does Australia really have in this anyway? And, before the election, the government took the view, and I think it was based on polling, most Australians didn't want to know about this conflict. It's a problem far, far away. It's awful. Don't get me wrong. It was interesting, though, to see Jerome Laxale on Sky the other day, the Bennelong MP, saying it's started to be raised by his constituents. So maybe that's played a role in the sort of change of government on it. But I just see this recognition step as pretty meaningless because we're recognising it, but we don't want Hamas involved. OK, so how's that going to happen? What does it even mean? They've always been for a two-state solution. Both sides of politics have. Are we any closer today because of what Anthony Albanese said to a two-state solution? I severely doubt it.
Yeah, he thinks we're going to deal with Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, who are said to be corrupt and, they haven't had an election since 2006. It's going to be very difficult to deal with that sort of an organisation. You're going to be in the US for that I presume for that UN address or meeting that Anthony Albanese is attending. So the focus here is now going to change, isn't it? To what has this done any damage to our US alliance? And when you hear Marco Rubio, Andrew, you've got to think that internally in the inner circle of Donald Trump, they're not all that happy about what we've done here.
No, they wouldn't be. I mean, Trump threatened Canada over tariffs if they said they'd recognise Palestine. But that's why I said in an interview with Penny Wong a couple of weeks ago, Steve, have you picked up the phone to Marco Rubio if you're so concerned about Gaza? See, the way to this ceasefire, and it wouldn't necessarily occur, is through the US. It's the greatest hope. It really is. You could argue also the Arab states, and that point's been made in recent times. They're trying to work towards it. But from our perspective, the biggest thing that Australia can do is not team up with the Britain and France and Canada and so forth. It's to get onto the US and work with the US to try and produce a ceasefire, if that's such an important goal for us. And, it really sort of surprised me that Penny Wong hadn't called Rubio until she finally did the other day. And even she said in that interview, Steve, the greatest hope to a ceasefire is clearly the US, because look at what they've been able to do with Israel and Iran. No one else can do that. So it's a very important meeting if Albanese does meet Trump, in terms of at least pressing some of the hopes for a ceasefire there, apart from our own considerations, top of the list being AUKUS, then tariffs. But I just don't see how working without the US on this has any effect whatsoever.
What happens if he doesn't get a meeting with Trump?
Well, he gets a whole bunch of headlines saying he still can't get a meeting with Trump. Look, that's not the important part, right? In fact, it doesn't really matter if Anthony Albanese doesn't meet Trump for 3 years. The issue is, does AUKUS get dumped? That's the issue. Now, the thing is, I was all for he has to meet Trump, and I still believe he does. But we didn't have our tariffs altered, right? So the real question is around AUKUS. And that is the primary issue. So if he doesn't meet Trump, embarrassing headlines. If he doesn't, if the US then, whether he meets him or not, dumps AUKUS with this review on, well, that's a much bigger issue. That's a much greater moment. That means we've wasted 15 years not getting submarines when we're an island nation, which would be crazy. So my biggest fear for Australia is that AUKUS falls over, not really whether or not Anthony Albanese meets Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think we all hope that won't happen. The other big story today, of course, is the rate cut, now sitting at 3.6, 3 rate cuts in a row. I think if you listen to Michelle Bullock today on Sky, you would have heard her talking about maybe another one. Some people say there might be another 2. Jim Chalmers looks pretty happy with himself, but he goes into next week, which we'll cover in some detail next week, this round table where productivity's in the toilet, people's wages are going nowhere, there's redundancies all over the joint. The economic, the Treasurer doesn't have a great economic story to take to his round table.
Well, he's got low inflation, low unemployment. That's what you usually look for. The issue is economic growth and productivity. And that's the argument for more rate cuts, but also, tax cuts which can help business. That's what we need. I'm concerned about this reliance on either government-created jobs or government jobs, whether it be the NDIS or through government subsidies to childcare or even through Medicare or whatever. That's the corner the economy's turning, which is of the biggest concern. The low inflation at the moment, low unemployment, is a good story. Interest rates coming down is a good story. But the challenge ahead is to make sure that we don't become some sort of command economy, Steve. And I'm not sure the government has any answers to that.
No, probably not. I always like to end our little chats with a bit of cheekiness. So before you go, the PM today, he did his breakfast crosses to breakfast television from Melbourne, from outside the MCG. You and I don't know why, it was nothing to do with the MCG or the AFL, but he was there. You and I are both from AFL states. Why the hell would anybody in their right mind mention rugby league when they're outside the MCG? Have a look at this, where the Prime Minister is standing there talking about the Rabbitohs and the Brisbane Broncos.
Oh, look, there are people on both sides of this debate who want conflict to continue, who want to think that it's like a football game between, South and the Broncos, and you've got to back in your team and you've got to back them in. What we need is a win-win.
Why would you do that when you're at the MCG, the home of Aussie rules?
Well, I don't know. I know he did the MCG crosses the day of the election. And so maybe he liked doing them, so he did it. But look, in fairness to the PM, he actually does. There's been a bit of controversy about which AFL team he supports, but he is a follower of AFL as well. He's been to something like 15 or 20 grand finals, Steve. So nearly as many as you, Steve, with your, Richmond support. But in fact, you and I met up for a beer at one, I recall. But look, so he does get into the AFL, but yeah, he's absolutely obsessed with the Rabbitohs, and they've had a shocker of a year. But yeah. Also, I mean, is he Hawks or is he Sydney Swans or is he something else? I still can't work it out. He claims to be Hawks, Anthony Albanese.
Greater Western Giants. Paul Keating once had a picture taken with wearing a Collingwood jumper.
I thought Keating was Collingwood.
So, really? He wouldn't have a clue, mate. Andrew, thank you very much. See you soon.
Cheers.